Alright guys, so I got some breaking, potentially big updates here for y'all on the prospects of a ceasefire in Gaza. So before I get into the latest on what we have here, I just want you guys to keep in mind that a lot of this is unclear, a lot of this is still up in the air, exactly how this is going to play out, and we have some conflicting reports to get to here, so I'm just going to lay it all out from what I've seen over the last couple of hours and, try to do the best that I can to analyze what's happening. So here from Phil Stewart of Reuters, okay? Breaking news, Hamas comes out and they say, we have accepted the ceasefire proposal that was on the table. So here are the outlines of this agreement that Hamas is claiming they just agreed to. So point number one, ceasefire proposal is a three-phase agreement. Each is 42 days, and this is according to Hamas's deputy Gaza chief. The second stage of the agreement entails full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. Point number three, Egyptian mediators said that they would guarantee that the war would not resume in Gaza. Point number four, the ball is in Israel's court. They say, I think this agreement satisfies all parties. And point number five is no restrictions in the agreement on the return of displaced people to all parts of Gaza. Okay, so again, a lot of this is kind of confusing. Some of this tracks with previous reporting on the negotiations that were happening behind the scenes about like a multi-staged process during which in each stage certain hostages would be released back to Gaza or released back to Israel. You would have Palestinian hostages who are held in Israeli detention that were also released as a part of that deal, and you would have sort of like a temporary ceasefire that I guess in theory over time could potentially lead to a long-lasting ceasefire. Now, the big point that conflicts with all of this is that Benjamin Netanyahu has been openly saying now for multiple days that regardless of whether or not there's a ceasefire put in place or a hostage deal put in place, that they are 100% going into Rafah. And so if that's the case, then I don't really see how this ceasefire is anything real, right? Because clearly if Israel's about to go and invade Rafah, that's not a ceasefire, right? So we have further reporting here. This is from CBS News. Israel-Hamas ceasefire hope fades, so it's already fading. Palestinians told to evacuate East Rafah ahead of expected offensive. So again, they're already beginning the Rafah invasion. They're telling civilians to evacuate, right? And we know what that means in sort of this Israeli speak, where they have been telling people to go to safe places and then bombing them as they go to those safe places and then also bombing the safe places themselves. So we know what these evacuations actually look like, right? It's not some like, oh, let's go out of our way to try to take care of the civilians in Rafah. That's not what that is. But I mean, if you're already telling them to evacuate, we've already seen, reporting that I'll get to here in a second just to remind you guys of multiple airstrikes that have been escalating in Rafah, killing civilians, then again, I don't know how Israel is possibly, going to agree with this ceasefire, right? Now we have some evidence to back that up here from Avi Meir. He says, breaking, Israeli officials are calling Hamas's announcement that it accepts the current ceasefire agreement a trick. It's a trick to accept the ceasefire agreement, saying that it refers to a one-sided proposal that did not receive Israeli approval and includes terms that Israel thinks are unacceptable, right? So what exactly are the terms that are unacceptable, that are from this part of the deal that Hamas was saying they approved of? That remains to be unclear. Again, I think it's very clear that because Benjamin Netanyahu said he was absolutely going to invade Rafah, regardless of whether or not there was a deal put in place, it's pretty clear that Benjamin Netanyahu wants to sabotage any sort of prospects for a real ceasefire, right? And that's been the case for months and months and months now, right? It was a long time ago that Hamas was fully ready to accept a ceasefire proposal that included the return of all of the hostages, as long as there was also a permanent end to the war, right? It's been Benjamin Netanyahu that has been rejecting that ceasefire proposal because he doesn't want the war to end. Because the second that the war ends, so does his political career. He could also be facing potential, criminal charges for his corruption inside of Israel. So he has every incentive in the world to not accept any sort of ceasefire proposal, hostage deal, regardless of how reasonable it is. But we also had this sort of reaffirming that same point. Israeli media is reporting that Israel is not likely to accept the ceasefire deal that Hamas approved, saying that it was softened and one-sided as an Egyptian version of the deal. Again, what exactly do they disagree with from the outline? That still is not clear. We haven't gotten reporting on that. Now, we also had this piece that you guys should go and read from Haaretz, basically detailing how Netanyahu had hoped that Hamas would reject the ceasefire deal, and then when it didn't, he turned to sabotage. And so this is basically talking about what I was just mentioning on how he comes out and says, we're definitely going to invade Rafah, regardless of the ceasefire negotiations that are currently going on. That was sabotage, right? That was his intention, was to throw a wrench in that negotiation process so that it didn't actually end up following through. Now, it is kind of a good move here, a good play from Hamas, even if they did change some of the parameters on what Israel wanted in the deal, and then they said they agreed to that. It is a good play in that sense because you also have domestic pressure with inside Israel. I'm going to show you some of the protests happening inside of Israel here in a second, but you have domestic pressure inside Israel of people calling for Benjamin Netanyahu to accept a ceasefire proposal that includes the return of all of the hostages. And you also have pressure from the international community, right, that is starting to turn against Israel, and even the U.S. government, right, coming out and saying they disagree with Israel's plans for Rafah. Now, would they actually enforce any red lines? Again, yet to be seen. There haven't been any red lines that have been enforced in any way, shape, or form, whatsoever throughout this entire process. So, the U.S. simultaneously is saying, we don't think that your Rafah plan accounts for civilians enough, but at the same time, we're going to give you somewhat of a green light to do a Rafah invasion, right? So we've been talking out of both sides of our mouth throughout the entirety of this, and it doesn't look like we're ready to use any real leverage to stop a Rafah invasion. It's more just like, hey, could you guys come up with a plan so that you don't annihilate tens of thousands of, innocent, starving civilians in Rafah? But Israel can't even meet that bar. Right, so the U.S. is still against their Rafah invasion plan. But again, Bibi has been sabotaging these negotiations for a while. And, throughout this entire process, we've had escalating strikes inside of Rafah. This is here from Jeremy Scahill. He says, Israel has been repeatedly attacking Rafah and killing large numbers of civilians, and now they're pledging to unleash extreme force against the people they have trapped in a killing cage. Keep in mind, there's over 1 million people. Half the population of Gaza has been stuffed down here into this tiny portion in the south, inside basically a giant refugee camp of sorts. He says, once again, Israel is using Palestinians in their sick version of Squid Game. And of course, I told you guys about some of these recent strikes that we've seen inside of Rafah. This was one of the more recent ones. Israeli strikes on southern Gaza city of Rafah killed 22, most of them children. In fact, 17 of them were children. And there have been other strikes that have been similar. There was another strike where they hit a bunch of children that were outside playing at a foosball table. And that was the only thing that they hit as a part of that strike, right? So this is what a potential invasion, right, inside of Rafah could potentially look like. We also have reporting here from Common Dreams. Nearly all 600,000 kids in Rafah, there's 600,000 kids in Rafah, are injured, sick, and malnourished, according to UNICEF. Injured, sick, and malnourished. This is the population that Israel is preparing to go and invade. Now, again, we have some pressure domestically inside of Israel. These scenes are coming out of Jerusalem. We also have protesters. This is one saying Hamas agreed to the deal. The government must agree now. Otherwise, we burn the country. Okay, so things are heating up domestically inside of Israel as well. If they just completely blow past Hamas saying they agreed to a certain ceasefire and just, continue with the invasion of Rafah, this pressure is only going to heat up. You could have the potential for just full-blown riots inside of Israel. We also had here in this video below some celebrations that were taking place in the streets inside of Gaza in reaction to the news of Hamas accepting a ceasefire proposal. And, obviously it's, good to see some people who are hopeful for a bit of a relief from this genocide, from this onslaught that we've been seeing over the last 6 or 7 months. But again, is this actually going to happen? It seems like Israel is giving every indication that they are not going to accept the ceasefire proposal that Hamas accepted, and they're just going to bulldoze ahead. Now, we also have at the same time, typical full-blown genocidal rhetoric coming out of the Israeli media. So this is a clip here. This is Shimon Boker, the vice chairman of World Likud, okay, the international arm of Netanyahu's political party. And he went on Israeli media and said this. Let's go ahead and listen to this.
צריך להיכנס בהם עד הסוף, עד שהם יצעקו את המילה חמאס.
אבל משפחות החטופים אומרים שאם תיכנסו לרפיח, החטופים ירצחו.
אבל אנחנו רואים מה הם עושים, הם צוחקים עליהם.
אז תסביר לי רגע מה דעתך, כי לא הבנתי,
אני חושב שצריך להיכנס, אתמול כבר לרפיח, להיכנס...
ואז מה יקרה?
להיכנס ולהרוג...
ואז הם יצאו מתחת לאדמה.
אין שם בלתי מעורבים, צריך להיכנס ולהרוג, ולהרוג.
הבנתי, וזה יחזיר את החטופים.
ולהרוג אותם שם, צריך להרוג אותם.
ואיך יחזרו החטופים בוקר?
אנחנו ננסה להגיע אליהם.
Listen, guys, I've said this a lot, but if you really want to get a perspective on what Israel actually thinks, what Benjamin Netanyahu's party thinks, go and watch translated interviews with their government officials, or just with Israeli media in general. Because when they're coming in front of a US audience, right, and Bibi is coming out and giving a statement in English, that sounds a lot different than the kind of stuff that he's saying in Hebrew to a domestic Israeli audience. And so you get clips like this on a major Israeli media channel where, a representative for their international Likud arm is coming out and saying things like, there are no innocent civilians in Rafah. We should go in and kill them all. I mean, this is the kind of shit that they openly say on TV in Israel. And it's also frustrating because then you have these conversations in the US media where they're just so confused. What are Israel's goals, right? Like, what's their, day after plan for Gaza, right? Is this a genocide? They don't even have that conversation, but is this a genocide? Is it not a genocide? They don't even talk about all of these openly genocidal statements coming out of Israeli government officials. I mean, they've been saying this since the beginning of this, since October 7th. They've been saying exactly what their plan is for Gaza, to wipe it out, right? That's been their plan all along. And yet the US media is having conversations in like a completely different universe where somehow these kinds of statements just simply don't exist, right? But there you have it. Now, we also had a couple of days ago, or a week ago or so at this point, I covered this before, Israeli finance minister, this motherfucker Bezalel Smotrich, calls for the utter destruction of Rafa and an end to the truce talks. So these are the kinds of people that Netanyahu has surrounded himself with. Okay, these genocidal maniacs in his government calling for the utter destruction of Rafa. So where do you think the incentives are, the pressure is for Benjamin Netanyahu moving forward? Because that's his coalition that could fall apart and then he's out of power, right? And I'll finish off with this. We have apparently Israeli officials confirming that the U.S. told Israel that any uncoordinated operation in Rafah will lead to delays in weapons shipments and possible restrictions. So, I mean, listen, we're 6-7 months into a genocide. I'm going to believe it when/if I see it. If the U.S. actually starts withholding weapons from Israel in response to them going, guns blazing into Rafah, I doubt that Biden is going to take any sort of serious break from Benjamin Netanyahu. But if there was anything that was going to do it, it would probably be, Israel deciding to go in and, start massacring a bunch of civilians inside of this massive refugee camp with over 1 million Palestinians trapped inside of it. So, I mean, definitely dark times ahead. Again, this is just the latest information that I have. You have Hamas saying they've accepted a ceasefire deal. Israel is saying, it's actually a trick by Hamas, and they came up with a different ceasefire deal that we never agreed to. And you also have Israeli government officials saying full speed ahead with the Rafah invasion. And, Biden sort of, again, tepidly threatening to maybe think about potentially changing policy on Israel. So yeah, I mean, I'll try to keep you guys as updated as I can. I'm not convinced that this is a ceasefire that's actually going to end up happening. And unfortunately, if we see this invasion of Rafah, as you can tell from the hundreds of thousands of children that are trapped there, who are overwhelmingly injured, sick, malnourished, it is going to be an absolute nightmare.
Politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying